The other cell line is called the lymphoid cell line, the lymphoid stem cells, and they are only going to be made into lymphocytes. Lymphocytes are those that help us fight infections and so forth. This is kind of the stages of red cell maturation. You start with a pro-erythroblast up here. It turns into a erythroblast. Notice it develops all these basophilic stippling. Then we call it a polychromatophilic erythroblast, and then comes a normoblast. A normoblast is an immature white cell. We used to always call them nucleated red cells because they still had their nucleus in them. And then at about day 4 or 5, that nucleus gets pushed out, and then it becomes what's called a reticulocyte. It looks like a regular red cell. It's not the normal shape, it's just round, but it has this stippling throughout it. That's why it's called reticular. Like reticulated giraffes, you know, that have spots on them. But anyway, so here's a reticulocyte, and normally they don't come out into the circulation. This is all just happening in this gray box here, which is the bone marrow. All of these steps should take place in the bone marrow. But indeed, some of the reticulocytes at this stage get thrown out into the circulation a little bit too early. And when they get out into the regular circulation, they quickly turn into this mature red blood cell as visualized down here at the bottom. Now, if a patient has got some problem whereby they're making too much blood, or they have they've lost a lot of blood and their body is shifted into overdrive, making lots of new blood, then this whole system gets speeded up a lot. And when it gets speeded up a lot, you know it by two ways. One is you'll occasionally see a normoblast, a nucleated red cell, in the circulation. That's pretty unusual, but it is not unusual to see a bunch of reticulocytes. Normally, reticulocytes should be less than 1% of the red cells that you see when you look at a smear. If you see somebody that has 8 or 10% of their red cells are reticulocytes, their body is really working overtime throwing those things out, and they're just getting out in the circulation a little too early. Doesn't mean they're abnormal cells at all. It just means that the hemoglobin and the red cell manufacturing process is shifted into overdrive. So what is it that controls this level of blood creation? Well, you got to have the building blocks. You got to have the amino acids. You got to have iron. A lot of times if you've lost blood, or if you're losing blood, and for some women who lose a lot of blood every month in their menstrual period, they need to take some iron to make up for that. You also need these 3 vitamins, B12, B6, and folic acid. We've already talked about B12. You can't get, no, we haven't either. That comes in digestive. B12 is absorbed through your gut. And it requires a substance called intrinsic factor to be absorbed, which is secreted by the stomach wall. And if you don't have a stomach, you can't absorb the B12, and therefore you'll develop what's called pernicious anemia, which is basically just lack of B12. And so that's one type of anemia. Your blood count can get very low from that. It's very rare these days, but nonetheless, that's what B12 anemia is. So here's a set of these red cell terminology and these tests. These are the numbers that you get back on every single blood test that you ever order or ever see. The hematocrit is probably the most common one we talk about. The normal is 45, and so I would just throw out all these numbers and just remember that normal hematocrit is 45. If you have way too much blood in your system, that's called polycythemia. And people can get polycythemia from different kind of growths or tumors or overdoses of different things. And polycythemia, it means your blood gets too thick. And you run your hematocrit up to 60, or even 55 or so, your blood gets really thick and sluggish. It can clot and give you all kinds of problems. So polycythemia is not good. You don't want to have too much blood. If you don't have enough blood, we call it anemia. And as a result, you just don't have enough. And that's not good either. That usually always occurs after a bleeding episode. If you lost a couple units of blood from something, you're going to be anemic. But in a few weeks, your body will build it right back up and you'll be back to normal. The reticulocyte count, I told you, was normally less than 1%. Those are the little speckled ones. That means they're being thrown out too quick. You call if this number is elevated, you call it reticulocytosis. But remember, what it means is the cells aren't abnormal in any way. They're just being thrown out of the bone marrow a little quick. The hemoglobin concentration, remember, goes back to our 15. We're using the number 15 for this one. 15 grams per deciliter. And it should be 15. And the red blood cell count should be about 4.5. That's the number of red cells per microliter, as illustrated there. So just remember these three numbers, because those are the three that you'll hear about all the time in clinical medicine. And that is, the red blood cell count is normally 4.5 or 5. I guess I told you 5 is the number to remember there instead of 4.5. 5 for the red cell count. Triple that, triple the 5, and that gets you to 15. 15 is the normal hemoglobin concentration in grams per deciliter. And then 15, triple that, and it becomes 45, and that becomes the normal hematocrit. So I could always look at any one of those three numbers, either the 5, the 15, or the 45, and I knew where patients stood, whether they had enough blood or not enough, or were about right. So that's why I try to simplify it for this class into those three numbers, and they're really easy because they're triples of each other. There's a couple other numbers that you'll see printed on most blood counts. One of them is called the mean corpuscular volume. In other words, that's the size, how big is an average cell, an average red cell. And the average volume is listed there. Do not know it. Don't worry about it. The other one is the mean corpuscular hemoglobin concentration. In other words, how much hemoglobin do they have in each cell? It's the average amount of hemoglobin in each cell. And your cells can be either normochromic and be about the right level of redness. They can be hyperchromic, in which they're intensely red. They have lots of extra hemoglobin in them. Or they can be hypochromic, means they don't have enough redness, they don't have enough hemoglobin. So just remember that the MCV generally means, it does mean the size of the cells, and the MCHC, mean corpuscular hemoglobin concentration, means the redness of the average cell. And when you look under the microscope over in lab, you're going to see those different types as well. EPO, we've talked about, erythropoiesis stimulating hormone. Your body makes EPO whenever the oxygen levels in your body drop, and that's usually because you don't have enough blood to carry oxygen out there. It also occurs in some diseases, especially lung disease, and so people with the old guys that are lungers, they normally bump their hematocrit up maybe to 55, even to 60. If they can't breathe well enough, they need extra blood cells to try to make that all happen. So keep that in mind. And then also, if you go to high altitude, so if you live here in Portland, which is at elevation, I think, about 85 feet above sea level, you'll probably have a normal hematocrit of about 45. If you went and lived in Denver, Colorado, or went up to Vail or Aspen, Colorado, and stayed up there for 2 or 3 weeks, you would build up more blood cells. Why? Because there's not as much oxygen in the air. That makes you hypoxic, as illustrated here, and you need more red cells. You need more hemoglobin, and so forth. So your body would very normally build up more red cells. So whereas 45 may be normal here in Portland, in Vail, Colorado, if you live there for 2 or 3 months, your hematocrit might get up into the low 50s. Now, that's really, you'd think, well, that's kind of like blood doping as well, isn't that? Like using in you're doing something to enhance your performance if you can raise your hematocrit like that. And that's exactly right. It is. It's a legal way of doing it. And if you ever wondered why the U.S. Olympic training centers are all in Boulder, Colorado, it's at about elevation 5,000 to 6,000 feet. If you go there as an Olympic athlete and stay there for a month, you will naturally build up your hematocrit up higher, so you'll have more oxygen carrying capacity. You'll be able to run stronger and longer. And that's great if you're going to stay there until about a week before the events, and then you come down to sea level at, one of the places where the Olympics has been lately, which have mostly been at sea level, then you're competing with an advantage, but that's not cheating either, at least according to the U.S. Olympic Committee. So both high altitude and different diseases will raise your crit up there. Let's talk about blood typing for a few minutes. Everybody, I bet most of the people in the class don't even know what blood type they are. But basically, the whole idea of blood typing and of blood recognition in our bodies is so that we look at our own red cells and think, oh, those are normal, they should be here. And we look at any abnormal cells or from cells from somewhere else or from some other person, and we say, oh gosh, those are abnormal. We want to eat those up and make them go away. So if you just keep that in mind, you'll understand how blood typing really works. Now, blood types are genetically determined. You get one allele from your mama and you get one from your daddy. And the alleles that you get from your mama or daddy, let's just forget about D for a minute and say that you can get an A, a B, or an O from your mom or dad. I gave you that problem that you need to work on over the next week or so. I gave you a handout for it today, and if anybody didn't get one, ask me. But basically, so you can be AA if you get an A from both of your parents. You can be AB if you get an A from your mom, say, and a B from your dad. You can be BB if you get a B from both parents, or you can be BO, where you get a B from one parent and an O from the other parent, and you're known as type B blood. So that's how you get the A, B, and O. RH is also called the D antigen. It's separate from the A's and B's, but just as important, it's also called the rhesus factor, or D, as it says there. So the four basic blood types, not dealing with the RH thing, can be either AA or AO, BB or BO. They can be AB. The only way you can be AB is to get an A from one parent and a B from the other parent. Now this could be the mama and the daddy, or this could be the daddy and this the mama that you got them from. But you had to get a different one from each parent. And then O means you got an O from both parents, because the only way you can be type O is to be OO. Now you remember probably back when we were doing genetics a little bit in 112, that these are what we call codominant alleles. In other words, the A doesn't rule over the B, and if you have an A and a B, you become AB. But it does dominate over O. So if you have an A and an O, you become blood type A. If you have a B and an O, you become blood type B. That's the way it works. Those are the genotypes. The genotype would be either AA, AO, BB, BO, AB, or OO. So let's look at that kind of on a more schematic basis and just realize that if you have blood type A, that means that on the surface of your red cells, you have these antigens, which are proteins of the type A. Okay? Now, if you have type A on the outside of your cells, your body goes ahead and makes anti-B antibodies, which will prepare you that if you ever got a single blood cell that was type B, these antibodies would attack that cell, eat it up, and then make it go away. So type A, when you think blood type, think the antigen on the surface of the cells. So type A folks have the A antigen illustrated by those little round balls up there on the surface right there. If you're type B, schematically they just drew it as little triangles. Those are the proteins on the surface of the cell, surface antigen B. And anybody who is surface antigen B also develops anti-A, so that they have anti-A antibodies in their blood, so that if they were ever given any A blood or became exposed to any A blood, they would immediately eat it up and make it go away. By the same token, a person who is type AB blood has both surface antigens A and surface antigens B, and since they have both of them, they don't make any antibodies, because if they did make antibodies, they would attack these cells and make them eat them up. That's not what you want. And finally, if you're O, like I am, I have neither A or B on the surface of my blood cells, but I have anti-A and anti-B antibodies. So if I were to ever receive any A blood or any B blood, my body would attack those cells, eat them up, and make them go away. Rh factor is kind of the third one. That's the plus or minus. So I'm O positive, which means I do have the Rh factor. The other name of it is the D antigen. The Rh comes from rhesus, R-H-E-S-U-S, which is basically the genus of monkeys, which I guess is where they thought maybe it came from originally. At least it's where it was first discovered. So you can either be Rh positive, which means you have that antigen, or you are Rh negative, which means you don't have that antigen. So if you're, you could call it D positive, you can call it Rh positive, D negative, whatever. The only people that have Rh antibodies that would fight off some Rh antibodies is someone who was sensitized. In other words, at some time earlier in their life, they had been given some Rh positive blood, and they reacted to that as abnormal. They created a bunch of antibodies to fight off that if they ever got exposed to it in the future. Now that point I just made is very important, as we're going to talk about in a minute. Let's talk about the Rh problem in babies. And any of you ladies who have ever been pregnant, you know one of the very first tests they're going to do on you is they're going to blood type you. Because what they want, what your doctor wants is for you to be Rh positive. And indeed in America, most women are Rh positive. And that's great. The people that have problems are those mamas who are Rh negative. And it's not a problem for them unless they have a baby who happens to be Rh positive. So now in that top picture up there, you see that it talks about this. So this is the first pregnancy, and this is the mama's blood going through the placenta, and mama's blood is Rh negative up there, and here's baby's blood. Baby got Rh positive from the daddy, and so the baby's blood is Rh positive. Once again, that is no problem at all, because throughout pregnancy there is no sharing of blood. However, at the time of birth, as the placenta rips away from the wall of the uterus, there is mixing of blood. The mama's blood gets into the baby, and the baby's blood gets into the mama. Not really a problem for the baby in general, especially in this case, because that baby, it's just not a problem. The problem is this way: some of the blood cells from the baby, which are Rh positive, get into the mama. And then the mama forms a whole bunch of antibodies against that Rh positive. Okay? Now, once again, nobody even knew that was happening. In this modern world, in America, they would know exactly what type of blood both mama and baby were, and they can prevent this. But say we didn't have that knowledge, which is the case in most all of the world, and some of this Rh positive blood gets into mama, and mama now makes Rh antibodies against Rh positive blood. Well, once again, the baby's gone, so that's no problem, and it takes a few weeks to make all those antibodies, but here we are in a second pregnancy, and this is where the real problem occurs. Because although the blood doesn't exchange across the membrane, the placental membrane here, antibodies can go across. And so since the mother made all of these antibodies, illustrated by these blue Y's up here, she made all those antibodies to fight RH if she ever got RH again. If she has another RH baby that's RH positive baby, then her antibodies will cross the membrane, go into the baby's circulation. That's what this is. This is the fetal blood. And when those antibodies get in with the RH positive blood of the second baby, it will destroy that baby's red cells. These babies oftentimes die in utero during the pregnancy because their red cells are all destroyed. That's what happens when you get the antibodies attached to the antigens. It destroys the cell, as illustrated in that little diagram there. So that's not what we want to happen. And the way that this is prevented these days is by a medicine called RhoGAM. Many of you, maybe some of you in the room have received it. The deal with RhoGAM is it's basically injecting the mother at the time of delivery with a bazillion antibodies, RH antibodies that would fight RH. The reason what that does then is the mama then thinks, well, gee, I've got all of these antibodies, and so what if I just got exposed to a little bit of that baby's blood? I don't need to make any more RH antibodies because I've already got millions of them, and so therefore they do not mount an immune response and they do not create any antibodies. Now those antibodies that you gave that mama will be gone in about 2 weeks because that's kind of their lifespan and they're gone away. RhoGAM is given to any mother who is RH negative and had a baby who is RH positive. Now, not quite that simple because what happens if you had a miscarriage or you had a pregnancy that was about 2 months late and you lost it and it wasn't very impressive. It was just a little bit of abnormal bleeding that month and you think you might have been pregnant but you really weren't even sure. Well, that's okay because if that little fetus had made some RH and then you gave it to the mother, the mother can become sensitized. That's what we call it when she develops a whole bunch of these antibodies. She would be sensitized even though she didn't have, the baby wasn't born. That's why if you are RH negative, it is very important for you to pay attention to that sort of thing. And if you ever think you might have been pregnant, even for a couple of weeks, you need to go get a shot of RhoGAM immediately after you have that little miscarriage to see if you have been sensitized. If you have been sensitized, then it's a really tough problem. And just know that if the mother is sensitized against RH and she has a second baby or third baby is RH positive, as illustrated in this case right here, those antibodies will get into the baby's blood and destroy the baby's blood, and that will oftentimes destroy the baby. Just another illustration of the same thing I've been talking about. Let's talk about blood transfusion reactions for a minute. Obviously, the best blood to give anybody is blood that's exactly their blood type. In other words, if you're A, it's best if you get A blood. If you're B, it's best that you get B. The thing we don't ever want to happen is have you get a wrong unit of blood that you shouldn't have gotten, in which case that unit of blood has all these antibodies that then attack your blood and cause this massive transfusion reaction, which basically means the blood will agglutinate, the antigens will hook onto the antibodies will hook onto the antigens and destroy the cells. That can kill the recipient of a wrong unit of blood. So as you go into healthcare, one of the things you're going to have beat into you over and over and over again is that if you're ever in the position to give someone a unit of blood, it's absolutely important that you verify the name and the identity and the blood type of the blood that is being given and the person that's receiving it. So usually it'll take 2 or 3 nurses all together. They each check the name tags, they each check the blood types, and make sure it's for the right person and make sure that the right person gets the right unit of blood. because a transfusion reaction, like I said, is often fatal, and at minimum, it's a very, very bad sickness that the patient gets from all of this hemolyzed blood that certainly is in their system. Because here's what happens. If the person was this type here, which I think is type B based on our previous diagram, it's type B blood, and this person over here, and they have antibodies against B, so you're giving them this blood, and they have those antibodies. Those antibodies are going to hook onto these antigens. These cells are going to all be destroyed and hemolyze and clump. That clogs up people's kidneys, that clogs up their brains. It can clog up everything in their body, really, and a transfusion reaction is a very, very serious problem. So in addition to testing all units of blood to make sure we know what type it is, we also do what's called a cross-match. And a cross-match, think about it, it makes pretty good sense. If you're going to be giving this blood from this bag of blood over here, and you're going to give it to this patient over here, doesn't it make sense to take a little tube of the patient's blood, take a little tube of the blood from the bag, and put them together and see if they react with each other? That's what a cross-match is. You're cross-checking everything. You're making sure that there's nothing in the donor blood that's going to react with the recipient to cause a transfusion reaction. And so that's what they do. Now, the problem is that cross-matching takes about another 25 minutes or so to do. And if somebody rolls in the emergency room with a bullet hole in them, you don't have that 25 minutes to wait. You've got to start giving them blood immediately to save their life. And what we do is we have a bunch of blood always stored in every blood bank that is O negative, because O negative is the universal donor blood. You can give O negative to anyone and it won't hurt them, at least on a problem with the A, B, O, or RH antigen, which are the main ones that we have to be worried about. There are other minor antigens that can cause minor transfusion reactions, but those are the big ones right there. So we can get by with using type O negative blood. And generally in the emergency room, that's what we would do. We would have to call and have to sign specifically for O negative blood, non-cross-matched blood, because that's what we were giving, was blood that had not been cross-matched, had not had that double check. Never had a problem with it because the O negative had already been screened for any other antigens in it as well. We're going to do blood type testing in lab in the next week. And basically what that does, the way we do that is we have bottles of serum, little squirt bottles that have anti-A, which is the antigen, is the antibody against surface antigen A. We have another little squirt bottle that has anti-B and another one that has anti-D, in other words, the RH antigen. So if this person, for example, this on the front line here was, on the top line, was actually A positive, that's their blood type, then if you give them anti-A, it's going to clump up and eat up their cells because the antibodies, anti-A, are going to react with the A antigens on the surface, and those are going to clump, and that's what it's going to look like in the Petri dish. If you give them anti-B, it's not going to react with them because remember, they don't have B antigens. They only have A. They're A blood. And same if you give them anti-D and they're positive, it's going to react with them as well. So by checking a random unit of blood, a blood sample, and testing it with anti-A, anti-B, and anti-D, you can determine what blood type it is, as illustrated in these. So this is blood type B positive, and you see B positive is not going to react to anti-A. It is going to respond to anti-B, and it's going to respond to anti-D. Why? Because it's positive over here for the D antigen. If you're AB positive, you're going to react to all of them because you've got not only the A antigen, you've got the B antigen, and you've got the RH antigen. If you're O negative, you're not going to react to any of them because you don't have any of those antigens. You don't have either A's on the surface, you don't have B's on the surface, and you don't have the RH antigen. just of interest, these aren't very random things. And indeed, in Chinese Americans, Filipino Americans, Hawaiians, Japanese Americans, and Korean Americans, they generally have 100% of those folks have Rh positive blood. Obviously, long before they moved to America, they were in an isolated society that only had Rh positive blood. In the United States, overall in the United States, about 85% of us are Rh positive. About 95% of African Americans are Rh positive, 85% of Caucasians, and there's the numbers. Now, as far as these others, O is the most common blood type in America. Notice that in South America, it is the only blood type. They're 100% type O in South America. Now, you'd still test them, but... and so in South America, there's nobody with type A blood, there's nobody with B blood, and there's nobody with AB blood, because those genes just weren't in that population long ago. In Australia, it's just the opposite. They have lots more A's than anything else. So different populations around the world are different, but they can all be tested quite easily, and we can always find somebody to match most anybody's blood with. All right, let's talk about, that's so much for the red cells. Now remember, the red cells are 99.9% of the blood cells. Let's talk about the white cells for a minute. White cells don't have any hemoglobin in them, thus they're not red, they're white. They do have nuclei and other organelles, and they have several different functions. Their main functions are to fight off pathogens. Now, what's a pathogen? A pathogen is something that causes a disease. So a pathogen can be either a bacteria, it can be a virus, it can be a parasite, anything that can make us really sick. White cells often eat up stuff. They can remove toxins and wastes from our body. And, very important, they can also attack abnormal cells. Because all of us in this room are forming cancer every minute. We are having cells mutate in our body every second that would turn into cancer if not removed from the system. So whenever we create one of these abnormal cells, we have white cells that come in and say, wait a minute, this cell isn't normal, let's destroy it and get rid of it. And that's basically how our body defends itself against cancer, because we need this ability of our immune system to recognize things that aren't right and to get rid of them. Most of the white cells, some things are different about white cells, and these are concepts that I always had a hard time. But, we talk about white cells in the bloodstream, but actually white cells don't just live in the bloodstream. They can wander out of the bloodstream and get out into connective tissue proper. Do you remember when we studied connective tissue proper, we also called it, loose areolar tissue, things like that, several other names for it. But anyway, there were a bunch of white cells that were floating around out in that areolar tissue, and those were white cells that had migrated out of the bloodstream and